We should first
Great.
we should first start off talking about Baylor basketball and the fact that they didn't make the tournament.
Thank you.
Okay, let's roll. Hey, I'm David Liggett with datacenterHawk. I have Vice President Allie Greenwood with Jones Lang LaSalle's Data Center Solutions Group here with me, and we're talking about the data center industry. So, Allie, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Very excited. So, now you all don't know this, but I do. She just got back from New York, where
Yes.
you were being honored as a nominee for the Women in IT awards that are, I think, now hosted once a year in the United States. But talk about that and your experience there. And
Yes.
congratulations on being nominated. That's
Thank
awesome.
you very much. It was a very, very cool event, very cool experience. It was an honor to be in the room with so many amazing women that are just, continuing to promote the cause of women in IT in different industries. There's everybody there from, the CIO of financial institutions to people that are running, the business development and COO side of Google Cloud to women that are working within economic developments in different cities, in different groups.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a wide variety of industry verticals of women in IT, and it's a lot of fun.
That's awesome. So talk about your path to getting into the data center industry. And one thing we've talked about previously is just, women in the IT industry and a goal, I think, for the industry to continue to offer additional opportunities for women to get into the industry, and especially in the data center side of things.
Sure.
But just talk about your past experience and what you're doing today and how your past experience has benefited you.
Sure, absolutely. So I started out in the data center business, or my first entry into it, as I was working for a real estate investment and development company here in Dallas, Texas, and we were helping people underwrite different opportunities, helping them go raise funds and equity for different opportunistic opportunities that were more on the real estate development side. And towards the end of my tenure there, we had some guys approach us about a data center development in Orangeburg, New York, that they had found that they wanted to purchase and develop into a data center. And we had no idea what a data center was at the time, what it cost to build, what it cost to lease, anything about the economics, but you'd read all these things about the crazy high returns and just the different costs associated with it, and it just seems so different than the other asset verticals in the real estate industry. So we went and met with a couple of different industry experts and talked to them a little bit about data centers. And one of the first people we met with was Digital Realty Trust.
Okay.
And I sat down with the guys at Digital Realty, asked them 100 questions about data centers, wrote every answer I could down so that I could get back and do my job of underwriting the opportunity. And through that conversation and through that series of questioning with Digital Realty Trust, they actually said, it'd be really interesting. We're kind of looking for somebody to join our portfolio management team.
Yeah.
Would you have an interest in coming over? And I kind of got the data center bug. So it was a great opportunity, interesting time in the economy. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to go work for a REIT. I didn't know anything about data centers, but I thought, why not?
Come on.
And I learned everything I know today from working in that capacity over at Digital Realty. I think it was a great way to learn the industry, because I was learning it really from the numbers side, from the ground up, what it was costing us to build these things, how we were underwriting these different data center acquisitions and development opportunities, and then what we needed to lease them for in order to hit return metrics that would keep all of our shareholders happy. I think that gives a really unique perspective now that I'm on the end user side, on the tenant representation side at JLL. It's been a lot of fun because I think I can offer a lot of insight into why and how these things are pricing the way they are, what the true total cost of ownership is, and really be able to compare the different opportunities out there for our end users and how they best fit the requirements.
Yeah, it's one of the, I don't think in our industry, there's not a lot of professionals that have worked on different sides of the industry. Most of the time you'll see scenarios where professionals will get involved in a certain part of the business and then stay there for a long period of time. So the fact that you have that expertise, from an ownership standpoint, and also too, during that time, you probably were able to see how a lot of different users approached their IT infrastructure requirements. So, that being 5 to 10 years ago, now you being at JLL for a very long time, what have you seen changing with the data center user mindset? you sit down with healthcare companies, technology companies, financial users, and you walk them through the process of acquiring IT infrastructure. How have you seen that change over the last several years?
Quite a bit, as technology's changed quite a bit. I would say 5-10 years ago, we were, for the most part, convincing a lot of the end users to outsource for the very first time. A lot of them were end users, owners, operators of their own data center developments, whether it was on a campus or in a closet in their office building. And we were trying to convince them to kind of relinquish that control for the very first time, move that asset from one side of the balance sheet to the other, outsource some of those operations while still being able to, meet the risk thresholds that they were concerned about. Which was going to help them, lower their ongoing, operating costs. And that was a big, that's a big pill to swallow, I think, for a lot of users at the time. But it's amazing to see how just the technology in the data center industry has shifted so much over the last 10 years to where people are just looking to outsource as much as they can now. And that's kind of been the entrance of hyperscale cloud and what people look at, these hybrid IT requirements now and how much that's changed. They're outsourcing even more. But definitely 5-10 years ago is a completely different sell than it is today. Now our end users, their requirements and what fits their requirements is just a lot different. It's all about flexibility. It's about different services that the providers offer and how that's going to help them get through their next 5-year plan. I don't see very many end users that have a 10-year plan anymore. A lot of people are going, what does it look like? I can probably predict the next 1 to 3 years, but I'm not sure how much I can predict beyond that.
Which is the great challenge for companies that are trying to figure out what they're going to do with their IT infrastructure. Because, you make that decision for, probably 12 to 36 months. And then beyond that, it's very hard to predict, number one, how technology changes. Number two, internally, from a business perspective, if you acquire additional companies and other internal challenges that companies might have to change their IT infrastructure architecture. So I think it's very hard to know past, a limited period of time what's going to work best. So your comment about flexibility, I think, makes a lot of sense. How have you seen, you talked about risk. How have you seen data center users best evaluate risk? And, there's different levels of that. But how have you seen them, best evaluate risk, over the short term as well as the long term? How do they do that well? How do they look at, not from just a location standpoint, but from a technology standpoint, from who they're partnering with? What's the best way for a data center user to do that?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult challenge. I don't think anybody has said that they've nailed it, right? Yeah. I think for the most part, people are looking, I hate to keep going back to the term flexibility, but they're looking for the ability to enter a true partnership with a provider, that they know that provider is going to continue to keep themselves fresh on technology, keep themselves fresh on what's going on so that they can expand their services offering over the next couple of years. I think almost every one of our end users now is asking the question, what's your cloud connection platform look like?
Sure.
So that we can make sure that we have access to those different options as we go forward. Revenue portability, service portability. We've talked about that being kind of this new trend that's coming up. But people are starting to utilize that, utilize their spend across different connectivity options, express routes to Azure, or even, moving into some cloud platform services, some infrastructure as a service, things like that. So I think people are really looking for that flexibility from the provider, and looking at that as a long-term partnership. So how can they, mitigate risk, back to your point? They can do that by making sure that whoever they're partnering with is truly looking at that full scope and kind of in it with them, and having, frequent whiteboard sessions once a quarter with their, account rep, and talking about what that roadmap looks like for them as well as the provider. Yeah,
that's a great point. If you're thinking of a company itself from a risk standpoint, evaluating that consistently, you've got to bring in, your partners, the data center operators that you're going to be with, or even cloud providers, to really understand how they're changing moving forward, because ultimately the changes they make could impact what your risk tolerance is. So being with JLL, one of the top global commercial real estate providers, you all have relationships with companies all across the world. So obviously you focus, mainly North America, but you also have requirements that take you international to places across the world. How are you seeing that demand from your North American clients? And are they, asking you to evaluate markets in Europe, markets in Asia? What have you seen from an international perspective with clients that you work with?
Sure. It's definitely, coming up now more than it ever has. And I think a lot of it is driven by, again, to kind of go back to, interconnectivity and access to different opportunities across the borders. So I think that we're seeing a lot more end users look at the M&A activity that we're seeing on the provider side, or or companies like an Equinix who has dots on the map in a lot of different places so that they understand what the provider's roadmap looks like internationally. But we definitely have clients, and I think it depends a lot on the industry vertical, whether you're in the airline industry or you're in the oil and gas industry. They're always going to have kind of spots of interest to them, internationally, that they're interested in. They want to understand what the market landscape looks like there. We've got some great team members across the border, which have been very, very helpful to us when we do have a client that has a requirement over there, which has been very helpful. And I think that, the continued change in legislation and data privacy laws will continue to help, clients understand what kind of footprint they need to have internationally, in order to service end users across the globe. So it's definitely a trend that continues, and people do continue to ask questions about it. I still think that we're seeing, exceptional growth, across the United States, and certainly with the hyperscale providers setting up new nodes internationally, there's going to be obvious, onboarding as we continue to look to the future.
How has hyperscale, you mentioned the hyperscale cloud development, how has that changed, and besides the international perspective, but what other ways have you seen their growth and their development change the industry?
It's changed. The hyperscale providers have changed the industry dramatically. You see companies like Microsoft taking down 20 plus megawatts a quarter, across the country, in different markets. I think it's changed. Maybe we approach it first from the end user perspective. I think the end users are now paying attention to what the hyperscale providers are doing and where they're setting up nodes or on-ramps so that they understand where the availability zones are, et cetera. And they're, looking to make sure that they're going to have quality access to those cloud platforms and those cloud options and how they can best connect to those. So I think the end users are absolutely following where the big hyperscale providers are going. I think it's also creating an opportunity for the end users, because as that demand, creates supply in some of these markets, I think it makes a more competitive dynamic. And so you can see some pricing shifts and pricing trends when you follow some of the hyperscale cloud absorption. I think from the provider side, it's changing their behavior, pretty dramatically. I think you have a lot of providers now that have created a dedicated build construction product for the hyperscale providers. You have these different providers that have come out and said, here's my product. It's dedicated to cloud. It's a single tenant type building, and I can build it for X, and I can lease it to them for Y. And it's a different product than what they build on spec for Fortune 500 type client or an enterprise type client. I think you're going to start seeing some of the providers create campus ecosystems. So when they go down and you see providers take down 100 acres in Northern Virginia or Phoenix, I think you're going to see them create, a campus where there's a couple of single tenant dedicated buildings to these hyperscale providers. And then on the other side of the campus, there's some enterprise scale users, and it creates almost your own little cloud ecosystem right there on your own campus.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've seen the land banking in major markets across the U.S. and by data center operators with, efforts to be able to show not just those large hyperscale users, but also enterprise users that, hey, we're here today and we'll be here for a long time, moving forward, because we can grow by multiple facilities on, this campus, whether that's hyperscale cloud development or, facilities more geared for enterprise growth. Let's talk about that enterprise, user segment. And, traditionally, I think most people in the industry would agree that, let's say 5 to 8 years ago, there were more larger 1 to 5 megawatt deals in the market. We've seen somewhat of a shift of that. There's still those deal sizes there, but some of that demand is pushing down to smaller size requirements, and then the additional applications potentially are rolling into some of those larger hyperscale cloud deals. But that enterprise group that you all work with, what do they need to do to make the best decisions? Like, where do they start? I mean, obviously, these are companies that have teams, their IT group, their procurement group, their real estate group. They've got teams of people. But how do they start well, and then how do they work through that process well to make the best decision?
Sure, I think the strategy and defining the requirement and up front is huge, and then creating what a roadmap looks like for 1, 3, and 5 years is one of the, keys to success that
Yeah,
we've seen.
sure.
So when we have people that do have teams and they say, look, here's, to the best of my ability, here's our scalable demand from a 1, 3, and a 5-year perspective. Here's what our, roadmap looks like into public cloud and private cloud.
Yeah.
And here is how that's going to, affect with our, server cycle refreshes, because I think you're seeing a lot more of the enterprises starting to do server refreshes than they have in the last couple of years, or plan to do one very soon, because that, CPU has changed so much, the technology of that in the last
what is
couple
that?
of years.
So when those companies are doing those server refreshes, what does that create for the companies? What do they have to figure out as they work through that process?
Right. So, for the most part right now, based on the latest Intel CPUs that everybody's all excited about, and the HP, Apollo servers, it's creating definitely higher density environments than they've ever seen before. Historically, when you look at a lot of the Fortune 500 stack, their densities still continue to average, 3 to 5 kW a rack. They were utilizing, your standard 42 racks, but spreading it out, and compute was just not as dense as it is now with the afforded new chips that are coming out. And so I think you're seeing a lot of enterprises make that big investment, doing a server refresh, and then it's totally changing their stack and their cabinets, and it's creating a lot more of a dense environment compared to before. I mean, we're seeing even more traditional financial institutions starting to hit 7.5 to 12 kW a rack, which years ago it was just unheard of in that more traditional, even financial institution world. So I think that's changing everything for them. It's certainly shrinking their footprint. It's trying to figure out how they scale. I think they see themselves shrinking. They're certainly pushing more to the cloud than they ever did before. But those server refreshes are causing them to take a look at what does their compute look like today? What does their compute look like in 3 years? And what are things that they might want to virtualize, based on the new technology that's available and the different, public cloud products that are available.
Do you think that as those companies, migrate to more efficient solutions, and I agree with you, I feel like for probably 5 years walking through data centers, probably, 07 to 2011-ish, you would hear data center operators talk about, hey, we've created a high density solution here. So we can go up to 10 kW per rack, 15 kW per rack. But the reality was there were not a lot of users that were going that high.
Right.
I think today is very different. You can go into data centers today and they're not just talking about it. They're showing you, hey, this customer is actually at, 15 kW per rack or whatever it might be. Now, that's not for every company. And I think it takes a lot of planning and a lot of the right team members to make those decisions to be able to go and change to a high dense solution. But other than kind of changes with, challenges with defining the requirement. If you don't define the requirement, you're going to have problems down the road. What are some other pitfalls that you've seen companies, work through? And I'll give you an example. I think one pitfall that I think happens and can happen is when an organization is somewhat siloed. So you have 4 different groups. You have different ideas for each one of those groups. It might be the IT group, it might be the real estate group, and everybody has a different idea of what is the best solution. And if you have one group that's running that, at the end of the day, the question is, can we get that decision across the goal line and actually get something done? And I think my previous days doing this, we don't do that anymore, but that was a challenge for us, is always seeing, do you have the right people sitting there to make the best decision and that can actually do something? I mean, are you seeing that with some of the
that never
groups
happens,
that you work with?
Yes, quite a bit. So I think that is a pitfall, and I think the best way to avoid that is getting executive buy-in from each of those silos up front, which is very difficult. But, to explain to a lot of our end users that, look, I think it's very important that starting right now, while we're defining the requirement and starting to issue RFPs, et cetera, that we have legal team prepped. We know what legal resources are going to happen and be needed to get this thing across the finish line. We have finance involved. We'd love to get finance involved early on so that they can see the first rounds of financial analysis and what we are comparing, and it shows the process of negotiation going forward. Procurement, if there's procurement teams that need to be involved and that have been involved in the past, it's important to keep them apprised, because they kind of understand how to open and close out particular orders and business within the silo. Certainly IT, because
Yeah,
they're the
sure.
ones planning it.
Need 'em.
Yeah. Absolutely. They're the ones that'll absolutely define the requirement, put the requirement together. And then sometimes you have, kind of a real estate facilities
Sure.
role. Depends on, sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one or the other. But, absolutely, because they understand kind of what that process looks like, going out and sourcing different opportunities, evaluating different facilities, taking it all the way through a negotiation process.
Yeah.
And I think the more that you can get all of those groups involved earlier,
Yeah.
rather than bringing them all in later, you get faster buy-in, you get faster approvals internally,
Yeah.
and then the project's much more successful, and it causes everybody, a much more pleasant experience
Yeah,
throughout
sure.
the whole process.
What are the dangers of only evaluating one solution? So, I think, if I'm an organization and it takes, I get those people, the same group, and we get running down one path, and that seems to be the right path, but we're not looking at other paths simply because it's hard enough to get everybody on the same page. What am I potentially setting myself up for from a company perspective? Am I missing out on efficiencies? And what are some of the things that you see that a one solution path is going to set you up from a pitfall perspective?
Sure. I think, at the end of the day, sometimes you still end up back at that one solution and that preferred provider maybe that you had talked to and had the most interaction with at the end of the day. But I think sometimes you don't understand what's out there and what opportunities you might be missing until
Yeah.
you've seen the full display of it. And so I found that even clients or end users of ours that have maybe had their, heart set on one provider, they had a good experience with the provider, they had toured that provider earlier on and had a lot more dialogue with them, they might still end up being the best choice for them at the end of the day.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, what they end up signing up with them for is a little bit different because they learned,
Sure.
for better, for worse, by soliciting the market, understanding the different options and the services that are out there,
Yep.
and the different flexibility, points that are available to them. I think that they learn a lot about maybe something that they wanted or needed that they didn't know about early on because they were basically being sold a solution versus driving what that solution could be. I think sometimes when you go down a little bit of a silo with one provider, it gets a little bit one size fits all.
Yeah.
Versus when you're really truly solution selling and you're having other people solution sell
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
You're creating the requirement and then the solution together, and then you can kind of go back to that provider maybe that you think is your gut choice and what your gut instinct is, and give them kind of a new set of options to look at.
Yeah.
So it just gives you a new kind of fresh look on things. So I think not only is it important from a negotiation perspective to make sure that you're getting a fair market deal that's going to set your organization up, and you can look up the organization to the CFO and said, I ran the process, I understand, I feel like this is a good deal, that's what's going on in the marketplace today, but you're also getting a much better service because you've understood what's really out there.
That's good. Okay, so let's talk about compliance. So, you all work with a number of different types of users, not just from the industry vertical standpoint, but also from, size of companies, smaller companies, larger companies. How have you seen compliance change what companies or how companies look at the market?
Sure. Compliance plays into every single one of our end user requirements. And I've noticed even really in the last year that the way people meet requirements has changed quite a bit. So, when a client comes through and says, I need PCI compliance, well, before that absolutely meant that they needed to have a cage topper and they needed to have, cage material from floor to deck, and, et cetera. Well, now there's a lot of different ways to solve for PCI compliance. You can have, infrared beams at the top of the cage material. There's just a lot of different ways that people can solve for it than there has been before, which has been really interesting.
Yeah.
But yes, I think compliance is the heart of. We do a lot of airline industry
Sure.
requirements, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of compliance that are associated with those requirements. But I think compliance has just become an absolutely necessary item for every provider to have, and I highly recommend, and I think the providers show a lot better when they have a dedicated compliance team, or at least somebody on their team that's all they're doing,
They're
is making
focused
sure
on
that
that.
they're
Yep.
keeping up with all the compliance that are necessary. But it's almost I can tell you the last time I walked into a data center that wasn't SOC 2
Yeah.
PCI
Yeah. You bet.
compliant.
Yeah.
They're just becoming absolutely necessary items.
Yeah, I think that, I think the same way I would look at, the redundancies built into, power and cooling and things like that, the assumption like this is our expectation this never goes down. I think there is too an expectation on the compliance side of things, the basic compliances that are adhered to by data center operators that they'll have, and then if there's additional, you have some data center operators that I feel like are focused on government type of compliances or maybe healthcare that's driven more by like an industry vertical. Mm-hmm. So I think that's been really interesting to watch. So from a cloud standpoint, how do you think enterprises and companies can best evaluate how to look at their infrastructure and figure out what applications need to, remain in a company-controlled environment, like either a colocation facility or, their on-premise environment, and then what they can really put into the cloud? Like, what really makes sense from that perspective? How are you seeing companies evaluate that successfully?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways. I think a lot of companies bring in, third-party consultants to come in and help them look at application workloads and migrations and what makes the most sense for them. So we see a lot of companies go that route. I think another big factor that plays into it is security, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people look at, if email goes down in the middle of the night for a little bit, or there's something, that's okay. But then there are items like, financial transactions or insurance policies or things like that might have social security numbers, et cetera. Those need to be an environment where somebody can't go stick a thumb drive in the server and download things and walk out, et cetera. So I think that security plays into it quite a bit, as well as, reliability and high availability, depending on what the application and what the workload is. We are seeing more clients, I think, even within financial institutions, utilize a hybrid of public and private cloud. Because public, you can put things out there that you might not need as high of security and compliance around, and then you can still utilize cloud in some form or fashion, and get out of the business of purchasing dedicated infrastructure and doing server maintenance and things like that by utilizing private cloud. So we're seeing a lot of clients either build their own private cloud or utilize some sort of private cloud service that their own colo provider has to offer. So we're seeing a good mix, and I'm seeing more clients really set up their own private cloud stack just to utilize that type of mentality of virtual machines and spinning up workloads and instances just internally for their own internal business units than we ever saw before.
Yeah. Well, the data center industry changes quickly, technology changes quickly. When you think about the next 5 years and just how much change has occurred in the last 5 years, but, what do you get most excited about? I mean, what do you look at and think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with these things over the next 5 years?
I mean, I think, the obvious elephant in the room is how does cloud play into all of this? Mm-hmm. You're seeing these hyperscale cloud providers go out and take down massive amounts of data center capacity and space because they're seeing so much velocity, I assume, with clients signing up for cloud services. We're all storing more data now than we ever did before, and we still want to see our wedding pictures from 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. We still want to make sure that the video that we took at of our kid in the hospital on the first day they were born is available 15 years from now. We want it to load immediately. We don't want to wait for a spinny beach ball for 30 seconds, right? So I think that we're driving a lot of that, demand and absorption because we're requiring all of our stuff to be saved forever and instantly available to us. So I think that that's going to obviously continue to grow, and I think people are going to find new ways to take advantage of it. And I think what will be really interesting to see is how connectivity plays into that.
I totally agree.
We talk about driverless cars and things like that. If you can imagine taking 10% of the population of New York City and making just those cars autonomous and driverless, you now are putting basically a supercomputer on board of every single car in a 30 block radius, with high rises all around it. How is that internet traffic going to be able to communicate effectively and in a timely manner to be able to really transmit all that data? So it's going to be really interesting to see how that affects our world in terms of connectivity.
You bet.
So I think all of that will be really interesting following, driverless cars, big data analytics, how we're starting to use a lot of that data because we're finally collecting a lot of it that we never did 10, 15 years ago. So how people will start using it. But I think from just purely getting back to the data center industry, it's, just truly that flexibility around, utilizing different services, private cloud, public cloud, colo. I would be shocked if somebody that's signing up for a data center footprint today has that exact same data center footprint, 5-7 years from now.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. So how do they have that, confidence that they'll be able to shift around those services and be able to utilize their IT and their technology effectively for their company?
Yeah. 2017, I know you know this, but 2017 was one of the largest years as it relates to M&A activity in the data center industry. So obviously that has a very large impact on the investor community. It has a very large impact on data center operators from a competitive standpoint, as well as acquiring one company, acquiring another company. But how does that impact a data center user? How does it impact a company that's looking to place their IT infrastructure? We think in 2018 there will be, a significant amount of M&A activity as well. So how does all of that truly impact the data center user?
So I think it does vary a little bit by industry vertical. If you're a data center user that your core business is not necessarily technology and constantly refreshing a software as a service type company or something like that, I think you are going to really need to pay attention and rely a lot more on your data center partner, your provider as a partner, and making sure that, if they are potentially up for sale, who's going to buy them, those kind of things, having flexibility in your contract to be able to potentially get out of that situation if you need to, because I think it's going to be really important for them to pick a provider that truly is constantly evolving as a data center, in the data center industry.
Yes.
I think if you're a more technology savvy company that's really, pretty self-operable, but you're in a data center colo because you're looking for them to provide the capital and the roof and take care of the edges and the peripheral, I think that you can potentially be more at ease from a more passive investor that might own the asset that you sit in, because you're going to be really, really active. You're probably going to have teams on site that are constantly touching your hardware and things like that every day. So I think it depends a little bit on the industry vertical.
Very cool. I want to change gears totally. Okay. Did you fill out an NCAA bracket?
I did.
Okay, so let's talk.
There's not much left, but yes.
Let's talk March Madness for a minute. How did your bracket go? Do you have any teams left in the finals?
I have Duke, and it's slim to none after that. I have Kansas left.
Okay.
But it's getting.
So we have. Okay, so we have.
I felt like I picked a dark horse. I had Xavier going all the way.
Oh, okay.
Which was not the popular pick.
Okay, that's
my husband was not thrilled about it, but I thought it'd be okay.
So we have, I guess, left in it. We have Kansas and Villanova, and then Loyola, Chicago, and Michigan.
Right.
Do you want to predict a winner right now? Who you think? And I'll do it too. Let's see.
Out
of those four, who would you?
I'm going to pick Kansas go all the way because I'm a Big 12 girl.
That's right.
At the end of the day,
That's
so
right.
Pick Big 12, as are you. But
okay, I am a Big 12 person. I did watch the Kansas Duke game. That's probably one of the best games of the tournament. If you did watch it, I mean, it was really good. So it's hard to choose against Kansas, but I'm going to. So I'm going to pick Villanova. Okay. I think they have the best shot at this point. So I'm going to get probably hated on by KU fans, but because I have a bunch of buddies that are KU fans.
Right.
Not that they'd be watching our data center talk moment here. Anyway, hey, thank you so much for doing this. It's so fun to sit down with you. And if you want to find out more about Allie's group and their practice, you can get on Jones Lang LaSalle's website, go to their data center solutions group, and her team focuses on North American data center projects, but they obviously can help companies across the globe. And so anyway, thank you for your insight. Congratulations on being nominated for your award.
Thank you.
And we look forward to getting you back in here down the road.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.